Dr. McCormick from Georgia for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. May I say that it's been a pleasure working with you on this committee, as well as in Congress. I wish you all the best in your new endeavors. When this pandemic began, I wasn't in Congress. As a matter of fact, when this pandemic ended, I still wasn't in Congress. I was serving in the emergency department in the Atlanta suburbs as an ER doc doing night shifts, the entire pandemic. From beginning to end, we learned some things. And I'm going to ask you in a very concise way to state what you learned during this pandemic. Because we've come to an end. And really, this whole committee has been about what we learned. I hope we've learned some valuable lessons we can admit humbly where we made mistakes. I know doctors made a lot of mistakes from treating patients. So very briefly, Dr. Walk, what did the CDC learn? And make that in 30 seconds if you can, just an overview. What really did you learn that you did wrong? Microphone.
Thank you for the question. We learned a number of things through COVID. We learned that as the virus changed, we needed to also put out a lot of different guidance. And unfortunately, our guidance was more technical than the public actually had difficulty understanding. And so we've actually made some changes to try to streamline that guidance and make it more understandable for the American public.
Would you say that you could have admitted maybe to making some mistakes in interpreting the data and the science?
You know, the COVID pandemic...
I hope you'll say the right answer because it's going to be really important to the following on conversation.
The COVID pandemic happened over multiple years. We certainly made mistakes during that time.
Thank you.
We quickly tried to rectify those mistakes, and we learned and tried to get better throughout the response. We continue to do so. We revamped our communication, as I've said. We've improved our test development process. We've refined our guidance.
Didn't want to know what you did better. I want to know what you did wrong, because that's how we learn, right? I understand what you did better because we admit to our mistakes. How about the NIH, Mr. Tabak? What did the NIH learn that we did wrong?
We didn't take hold of all of our clinical trial networks early on in the pandemic, and as a result, a number of underpowered trials were conducted, and that sort of siphoned away the capacity to do the larger trials that were ultimately necessary. That was one thing. The second thing is we learned that we needed to forge relationships with industry much sooner to make sure that we could take advantage of all of their knowledge as we considered different potential countermeasures.
Okay, thank you, both of you. You know, as a ER doc who basically got exposed to a deadly virus, saw patients who were sick, watched patients die, watched the science evolve, and watched my fellow physicians get criticized the whole time by people who are not treating people. That hurt me a lot, and I think it really decreased the credibility of people who call themselves scientists who didn't even have science at the time. They had guesses, and they were guessing and outmaneuvering the physicians who were treating the patients and doing their very best. I'll tell you a few things that I learned as somebody who lived through this from the physician treatment side. First of all, the CDC gave blanket recommendations that were not scientific at times, quite frankly, because we didn't have science. We didn't know. But they still give recommendations that superseded what doctors could do, and it made people either not trust their doctors or not trust the CDC. You had to choose sides then. That's wrong. It became, instead of scientific, it became politically driven, in my opinion. I also think that we fell very short in accountability and transparency, the NIH. I think the way that we do our grant system and the way that we're trying to come up with the right answers according to who protects the NIH rather than who protects the people, in my opinion, based on the relevant evidence that we've received while we're here. But mostly, as in any crisis, doesn't matter if it's banking, housing, climate change, or disease, we should be hesitant to turn to a government for the answers. Bureaucrats and politicians are not experts and should never be allowed to infringe upon our inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Even when it's scary, we have the right to self-determine. We as Americans must always protect freedom, whether that be in our protecting of ourselves, which has consequences of possibly income or travel, or also allowing people to pursue education, transportation, or the best interest of their business, even if that requires risking their own health or income. That is America. That is the promise, not of security, but of opportunity that exists nowhere else in the world. Your discussion should be with your doctor, not intruded upon by the government that thinks they know better than both the doctor and the patient. We saw how easily it is for the government to take away our rights, to make our lives miserable if we don't comply, so that, as Dr. Fauci said, we lose our ideological bullshit. Quote, in order to get the favor of a government that is ruling instead of serving. That's what I've learned. Instead of turning to the government for the answers, we allow people to determine with their healthcare professionals what is best. And by the way, we won't all agree. And that's okay. The government should never determine who's right and wrong. Science, experience, and treatments determine what ends up being right and wrong. And that's a learning process that should never be intruded by the government. With that, sir, I yield. God bless you. Thank you for this committee. And let's go forth and do great things.